The program tonight will actually be in two parts. After we hear from Mr. Hughes, Mr. Louis Lomax is going to make a special presentation. We hope you will stay for the occasion. 34 years ago, in 1933, I sat in an auditorium of the St. Joseph, Missouri Junior College, and I heard Langston Hughes, only slightly younger than he is now, read his poetry and talk about his travels. He discussed the Nazis as a pointed reminder of our own brand of dehumanization here in the land of the free and the home of the brave. Coming from a smaller town in Missouri than Mr. Hughes' Joplin, I really didn't understand what the shouting was all about. Today, 34 years later, the message is coming through. Langston Hughes has remained an eloquent spokesman for those who have not been given a proper opportunity to share in America's promises. I would submit that there is a glory in Mr. Hughes' long tenure as a spokesman for our Negro fellow Americans, a glory that transcends his 65 years of good health, attributable in no small part to the fact that he was wise enough to choose relatives, particularly an uncle who at 89 is still a vigorous resident of Los Angeles. But there is a glory in the fact that Langston Hughes has never been one to seek center stage where the harsh spotlight of media, both hot and cold, has enticed the cacophony of new voices. He has not pursued a role of spokesman for the Negro, but rather as an artist who is also a Negro. But his fulfillment of artistic integrity has made him a spokesman, whether he has willed it or not. His main traveled road has been poetry, the poetry of selected poems, the bittersweet poetry of urban life in the best of simple, the basic poetry of jazz music. Langston Hughes knew about soul years before today's hippies picked up the term. He is a working writer. His novel, short stories, autobiography, anthologies, juveniles, plays, histories, translations, and recordings are eloquent evidence. I've always liked this poem. I've been scarred and battered, my hopes the wind done scattered, snow has frizzed me, sun has baked me, looks like between 'em they done tried to make me stop laughing, stop loving, stop living. But I don't care. I'm still here. And to our good fortune, so is Langston Hughes. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Hughes.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Thank you for your very kind welcome back to this campus. I have been here before and have read my poems here before, but it's been some years ago, and I hope that everybody who was here then has now graduated, and because really you're going to hear most of the same poems all over again, except that I don't believe when I was here last time I read this one called Motto. I play it cool and dig all jive. That's the reason I stay alive. My motto, as I live and learn, is dig and be dug in return. Well, I read you that poem because although it was written in the bebop era, about 15 or more years ago, it is seemingly on the way to becoming one of my most popular poems among the retarded readers. It is a poem that's being used increasingly in big city schools and in anthologies. And another poem of mine, which was written a long time ago, really, when I lived in San Francisco, and at one time had the title San Francisco, but I later made it a little broader in terminology and call it City now, is also finding its way into a great many anthologies for youngsters who never learned to read very well. And it goes like this. In the morning the city spreads its wings, making a song in stone that sings. In the evening the city goes to bed, hanging lights about its head. Well, if that poem increasingly is used in anthologies, I think I can make my living off of it for a year or two, because each one pays a nice little fee, you see, and they write me a nice little note and say it's just ideally suited for children who, who are a little over age and can't quite read well. So you can see from those two examples that my poetry on the whole is very simple, because most of my poems are equally simple, really. And I am delighted that we have among the younger Negro poets a number of poets who write very avant-garde, very complicated, and poets whom I myself, try as I do, cannot quite understand. And I asked one of them the other day why they put, one word way over on this side and then two words here, another word way on that side of the page, and then jump down about 6 pages and put another one with some dots. And I didn't get a very adequate explanation, except that it was a way of keeping the reader's eye moving about the page. Well, I must say that some of those of our younger poets, however, are very talented indeed, and I hope that you will watch out particularly for a young man named David Henderson, who is in some of the avant-garde anthologies, and a young lady named Alice Walker, who's a sharecropper's daughter from Georgia by way of Spelman College, and now has a fellowship to MacDowell Colony, where she's working on a novel. 21 years old, a very talented girl, both in prose and poetry. So I just throw out those two names for you in case they haven't reached the coast yet. And then, of course, somewhat older, but young too, and very talented, is a name that I'm sure you've heard out here, Leroy Jones. I hope you know Leroy's poetry, because Leroy is a very talented young man, inclined, to work on the shock side, and I'm sure he couldn't be published in Bruin, because I understand Bruin was recently suppressed for using a few mild bad words. However, he's a very talented young man. His plays particularly are brilliant, and they're about to release Dutchman in the movies. And I, as an older writer and an older poet and a more conservative one, at least as far as verbiage goes, words go, I'm glad that we have in the Negro race poets like Leroy, because there are a lot of poets like Leroy in the White West, including Allen Ginsberg, whom I just read today was censored out somewhere at some college where he was supposed to speak tonight. I don't know if you've had Leroy here. If you haven't, try and bring him and see what happens, What I was about to say, however, is that I'm glad that we in the Negro race have young people who are doing everything that everybody else does. I think we as American Negroes should do everything everybody else does, and usually when we do something, we often do it better, we do it we do it even more far out. So we have some avant-garde poets right now who are more avant-garde than the avant. My own poems, I've been writing poetry since I was, since I was about 14 years old. And I think I'll just start at the beginning and give you a little resume of how and why I began to write. I consider myself very American because I was born in the very middle of our country. I was born in Missouri, which is only a few miles from the dead center of America, because there's a geographical marker in the state of Kansas that marks the heart of the continental United States. And I grew up in Kansas, the very center of the country, until I was about 13 years old. I was born in Joplin, Missouri, but I was not intended to be born there. I belonged to a family that was always moving, and we moved about 10 days before I was born, so I was really born in the wrong place. I was supposed to have been born in Guthrie, Oklahoma. At any rate, I have lived all across America. We moved a very great deal, and before I could remember anything at all, we had moved to Buffalo, New York. Don't remember Buffalo. Then we moved to a place called Concordia, Kansas. Then we moved to Lawrence, Kansas, and I more or less grew up in Lawrence, where the University of Kansas is, so I'm sort of used to academic surroundings. When I was 13, as I started to tell you, we moved to a town called Lincoln, Illinois. It was at Lincoln that something happened that changed the whole course of my life, because I had never dreamed of being a writer or an artist of any sort, but what happened in Lincoln changed all that, and the way it happened was that I entered school late. We moved in October. The 8th grade class that I was going into had decided, they learned the high school class had graduation officers, so they wanted to have them, and they decided to hold an election. And the day I went into this class, they were talking about the qualifications for class officers. And the teacher was telling the class that a president should know how to run a meeting, and the secretary at least should know how to write, and so on. And when she got on to the very last office, the bottom of the blackboard, that was the office of class poet. And she said, and a poet must have rhythm. Poems must have rhythm. She stressed that word 2 or 3 times. Well, on the way home from school that day, because the election was to be the next day, the one other colored pupil in the class, a girl, said to me, we don't have to worry about that old class election. She said, they never elect Negroes to anything in these schools here anyway. And it turned out she was just about right. She'd been in the class for the whole 8th grades and had never had a class office of any kind, because Lincoln at that time was a kind of small American town where if you were colored, on the way home from school you couldn't get a hot dog anywhere downtown. If you went into the drugstore, you could buy everything in the drugstore except an ice cream soda and sit down and drink it. Couldn't sit at the soda fountain. If you went to the movies, they had one row, a half a row really, on the left, reserved for Negroes. I don't know why they always put us on the left, but they did. And if that one row were, that half a row were filled, you see, we couldn't go to the movies that night. So that was the kind of town Lincoln, Illinois was at that time, named after the great emancipator. Well, when I went back to school the next day, we started out the day by having the class election. And sure enough, all of the officers were elected down to the last office on the board, and the colored girl was not nominated or elected to anything, not even nominated. But when they got down to this bottom office, which was poet, class poet, there weren't any nominations at all. The kids looked around each other, and they didn't see anybody that even looked like what they thought a poet ought to look like, I guess, and there were no nominations. So finally the teacher said, well, you have to nominate somebody. Don't you want a class poet? And they said, yes. And she said, well, make a nomination. You have to nominate somebody. So a little white boy got up at that point and looked around at me and called out my name, and the whole class said, I, unanimously. That's the way I became a poet. Unanimous acclamation in the 8th grade. Well, I didn't want to be class poet either. I was very puzzled as to why they picked me out. But that night, thinking about it, and remembering that the teacher discussed rhythm, and remembering that all my life I had heard that most American white people think that all Negroes have a sense of rhythm, I said, well, that must be why they picked me out, you see. And I'm glad they did, because I wrote the class poem. It turned out to be 16 verses long. I had all winter to write it, and I had 8 teachers, and of course this was the 8th grade, so a verse for each grade, a verse for each teacher. When I read it at graduation, the teachers, parents, students, everybody applauded very loudly. First applause I'd ever had in my life. And I was so pleased by all of that applause that ever since then, I've just kept on writing and reading poetry. So that's the way I started out. That's really the truth. The next year in high school, and by the way, we had moved again. We moved to Cleveland, Ohio. And one of my classmates is here tonight from Central High in Cleveland. Well, that was a very famous high school at that time. It was, for one thing, the high school where several of the Rockefellers had graduated, you know. And we had a very good high school magazine. I looked at the magazine, first 2 or 3 issues, didn't see a single Negro student writing for this magazine. Well, as I've said, feel that Negroes should do everything anybody else does. And so I thought if there's no colored pupils trying to get into this magazine, I'll try. So I began to send little poems to the magazine. And every month they came right straight back to my homeroom. I don't think, in fact, I'm sure it wasn't prejudice. They just weren't good. However, after several months of trying, finally one of my little poems was published. From that time on, I sent poems, stories, articles to the magazine, and my first publication was right in school, in my high school publication. I'm going to read you one of the earliest of my poems to be published. It appeared in the Belfry Owl at Central High in Cleveland, and in these 2 poems I'm going to read you now, you can see the poetic influences on my work. You can see here the influence of Paul Laurence Dunbar, our very fine Negro poet of more than a half century ago. He died about the time I was born in the early 1900s. And in the second poem, you can see the influence of a very fine living American poet, perhaps the dean of our American poets now, Carl Sandburg. Because when I tried to write seriously, I tried to write on the one hand like Dunbar, in a kind of singing, lyrical, dialect verse, and on the other hand, in free verse like Sandburg, who was just coming to fame at that time, and who was also being censored. It's very interesting how censorship works. I remember an editorial in the Kansas City Star, I believe it was, denouncing Carl Sandburg because he wrote in free verse. And there was something immoral, presumably, about poetry that didn't rhyme at that time. Well, of course, he's one of our highly esteemed poets, the most highly esteemed, I guess, since the death of Robert Frost, and he's still living. This is a little poem in the style of Paul Laurence Dunbar called Dressed Up. I had my clothes clean, just like new. I put 'em on, but it still feels blue. I bought a new hat, sure is fine, but I wish I had back that old gal of mine. I got new shoes. They don't hurt my feet, but I ain't got nobody for to call me sweet. Pretty sad, wasn't it? That was one of the earliest of my, I guess you might say, my love poems. Well, this one was written, the next one, when I was a junior in high school. And it's really about a girl whose name was not Sue. The poem is called When Sue Wears Red. About a girl who came from New Orleans into our class in my junior year, and who, when she walked down the hall in her red dress, looked particularly beautiful to me. So I wrote this poem trying to describe her. I wasn't aware at that time of one of the things that I did in this poem. I was aware that I was trying to write free verse, unrhymed poetry, but quite unconsciously I have a little refrain that suggests the Negro spirituals. And later on, I quite consciously began to try to create poetry in the style of our folk songs, our spirituals, and our blues, and our work songs. This is the way the poem goes. When Susanna Jones wears red, her face is like an ancient cameo turned brown by the ages. Come with a blast of trumpets, Jesus. When Susanna Jones wears red, a queen from some time-dead Egyptian night walks once again. Blow trumpets, Jesus. And the beauty of Susanna Jones in red burns in my heart, a love fire, sharp like pain. Sweet silver trumpets, Jesus. That's the way I felt every time I saw that girl in the hall. But she didn't marry me, she married a football player. And the last time I was back home in Cleveland, I asked about her, and I was told that although she no longer lives there, many friends hear from her and have news of her, I was told that she'd been married 3 times since then. Well, anyway, these poems of mine will indicate to you how I began to write poetry, and the last one will indicate to you that many of my poems, like When Sewers Read, are about actual people I've known or places I've been, or are inspired certainly by situations in which I've been involved, as are many of my racial poems that I'll read you a few of a bit later. Well, no sooner had I gotten out of high school than I went to live in Mexico with my father. My father and mother were divorced when I was quite small, and he sent for me to come to Mexico, promising to send me to college. I stayed a year in Mexico, and I wrote 2 or 3 very short poems about Mexico, but the most famous of my poems, The Negro Speaks of Rivers, was written on a train going to Mexico. We were crossing the Mississippi River just outside of St. Louis, and I looked out the window of this train, and I saw this great muddy river flowing down toward the heart of the South, and I began to think about what this river had meant to the Negro people in the past. I remembered my grandmother had told me that in slavery time, to be sold down the river was just about the worst thing that could happen to a slave, sold into the rice swamps of Louisiana, the heat of the Delta. And then I had read, of course, about Abraham Lincoln going down the Mississippi River and how Lincoln had seen slavery at its worst when he was a young man, seen the slave markets in New Orleans, and of course we know that many years later Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation. So all of this came to my mind, and I took out an envelope, my father's letter really, out of my pocket, and on the back of his envelope I wrote this poem. Well, now most of my poems are written that way. They're what you might call spontaneous or improvisational poems, I guess. I'm not the kind of poet who studies and ponders and works in strict forms, and I'm not against writing in the sonnet form or the rondeau or whatever forms you may be able to master. It just hasn't happened to be my way of writing. This is a free verse poem, again, as you will notice. I've known rivers. I've known rivers ancient as the world, and older than the flow of human blood in human veins. My soul has grown deep like the rivers. I bathed in the Euphrates when dawns were young. I built my hut near the Congo, and it lulled me to sleep. I looked upon the Nile and raised the pyramids above it. I heard the singing of the Mississippi when Abe Lincoln went down to New Orleans, and I've seen its muddy bosom turn all golden in the sunset. I've known rivers, ancient, dusky rivers. My soul has grown deep like the rivers. Well, when I got to Mexico City, my father had planned out my whole life for me. He didn't know me very well, and I didn't know him very well, and we hadn't seen each other for 12 years or more. But he told me that he wanted me to go to Switzerland to college. And I said, well, why Switzerland? He said, because you can learn 3 languages at once. It's a trilingual country. They speak what? Italian, German, and French there. And you can learn mining engineering. There's a lot of money to be made out of mining engineering here in Mexico or South America. So you're going to Switzerland to college. Well, I didn't want to learn 3 languages at once. I didn't want to learn mining engineering at all. What I really wanted to do was to see Harlem. I'd never been in New York, never seen Harlem. Well, my father was very anti-Negro, although he was Negro in the in the American sense of the term, you know. And when I use the word Negro, I use it because it's the most common term, but I could say Afro-American, or I could say colored, or I could say, I don't know what else I could say, but anyway, out of deference to those who prefer some other term, forgive me because I just sort of grew up on the word and I can't get rid of it. and they called me a Negro poet all the time. And my father always referred to American Negroes as being stupid and no good, and he didn't think much of them. And why did they stay in the United States where, with all the color prejudice? Because he had run into some very harsh prejudice in his youth. And one of the things that caused him to leave the United States was that as a young man in Oklahoma, he wanted to be a lawyer. No place where he could study law. He took law by correspondence from a Chicago law school. When he applied to take the examinations for the bar in Oklahoma, they wouldn't even let a Negro take the examinations to be a lawyer. And you know how long it took to open up higher education to Negroes in the state of Oklahoma. And tonight I think we're going to have the honor of honoring a man who broke down the color bar, the first person to break down the color bar in regard to some aspects of higher education in that state. It took about half a century, you know. Well, at any rate, my father never came back to this country. He practiced law in Mexico City and died there some years ago. I finally was able to persuade him that there was a very good college in New York where you could learn 2 or 3 languages if you wanted to and prepare for engineering school called Columbia University. And I didn't tell him I really wanted to see Harlem, you see, at all. If I told him that, he wouldn't have sent me to Columbia. But he did finally pay my tuition to Columbia. First place I went was Harlem, of course. And most of the time I spent down the hill rather than up the hill. So when it came time to graduate, I hadn't passed physics nor chemistry. I'd only passed French and English. I don't mean to graduate, I mean to finish the first year. So I wrote my father and I told him that I decided not to try to be a mining engineer, that I had decided to be a writer. Well, I knew my father didn't think anything at all of writing as a profession, and he had reminded me that Paul Ernst Dunbar drank a great deal and that Poe died in the gutter from liquor and so on, and he had no regard for writing as an art or a profession. But nevertheless, I thought I'd be bold and tell him that I wanted to be a writer, which I did. And I said, but if you don't approve of my plans, you don't need to send me any more money. Well, it soon became evident that he didn't approve because he didn't send me another penny. And I found myself in New York City with $13. So I started out in life with that amount of money, and ever since then I've been making my own way in the world. $7.50 of my 13 went for room rent when I moved off the campus. You know, landlords, regardless of race, take advantage of oppressive situations, and so the Harlem landlords charged higher rents than they did downtown or in neighborhoods where whites could live. Everything was higher in Harlem, and still is. It's very curious to me how, well, take a box of shoe polish, which will be 12 cents downtown, it's 15 cents in Harlem right now. And if you want to get on the subway and spend 20 cents to go get the polish downtown, you save 3 cents. But why in the world should that be, that we have to pay more in our ghetto areas? I never have understood it and still don't. Well, anyway, I worked at all the kinds of ordinary jobs that at that time a Negro was able to get in New York, a young colored boy or man. I am happy to say that that situation has improved greatly, and certainly in New York City, and I think in most of our major cities in the North and West, because you never saw a colored secretary, for example, in an office downtown. Now, all of my publishers and most of the offices where I go have Negro stenographers, receptionists. About 3 of the bigger New York publishing houses now have colored editors. I mean, real editors who are in charge of, well, when I say real, they're not just in charge of reading Negro manuscripts. They can turn down a white book if they if they don't like it. I could only be an elevator boy or porter or shoe shine boy or waiter or something like that when I came along, because I tried the offices in in some of them I was told quite frankly, well, we don't hire Negroes here. Well, of course, nobody dares say that anymore. There are many offices, of course, that perhaps still don't hire Negroes, but they don't tell you it's for that reason. They simply tell you the jobs are filled or something like that. However, at that time, in Harlem itself, the Wilsboro stores had not a single Negro clerk, you know. And one thing we must give Adam Powell credit for is that he was one of the leaders in breaking down discrimination in Harlem, right in Harlem. And I am proud to say that my own first picketing was done right on 125th Street. You couldn't eat in Sraff's restaurant in Harlem at that time, right in Harlem. It's incredible what nerve the, shall we say, the power structure has. Well, all of that, of course, is completely changed. And speaking of department stores and so on, the Woolworth stores, for example, not only in Harlem now are there many, many Negro clerks in all the shops, the larger ones, but all over, I think all over the North. I know all the Woolworth shops downtown New York, Macy's, the smart shops like Lord & Taylor's, very elegant young colored ladies will ask you what you want in a very elegant voice in Lord & Taylor's, you know. Sometimes so elegant it frightens you, really. So you can't say that there hasn't been some improvements in some aspects of our racial situation in this country. So some of the poems that I wrote at that time about working conditions are no longer really timely or really valid. However, here's a poem that I wrote during the Depression. And since it looks as if we are getting sort of tangled up in relief and welfare and that kind of red tape, again, we are already tangled up in it, to tell the truth. During the Depression times, in some parts of our country, it was very difficult for Negroes to get on what they call WPA, the Works Progress Administration, which was the dole, really, in the giving out of jobs to save you from actually dying. And so I wrote this blues called Out of Work. And the WPA, those of you who are too young to know, it was a kind of government relief agency, really. What's the name of it they have for it now? You know, Sergeant Shriver, isn't he? When the guy's connected with it. In any case, this is what this man says. It's a blues, and here you see the definite folk influence on my work now. I walked the streets till the shoes were off my feet. I done walked the streets till the shoes were off my feet. Been looking for a job so's that I could eat. I couldn't find no job, so I went to the WPA. Couldn't find no job, so I went to the WPA. WPA man told me, you got to live here a year and a day. A year and a day, Lord, in this great, big, lonesome town. A year and a day in this great, big, lonesome town. I might starve for a year, but that extra day would get me down. Well, when my father didn't send me any more money and I couldn't go to college any longer, and I couldn't find a job that offered very much, and I wasn't making enough in New York to enjoy the cultural opportunities of that, to me, quite wonderful city. It's a city I love very much, but I never made enough to buy a ticket to the Metropolitan Opera from washing dishes, you see. So I decided to get on the boats and see the world. So I went down to South Street and West Street, the Waterfront Streets, and began to try to find work on the ships. At first, I didn't have any success at all, but I had dreams of where these great big boats went, and so I wrote a number of poems at that time, and this is one of them called Waterfront Streets, which described the way I felt. The spring is not so beautiful there, but dream ships sail away to where the spring is wondrous rare and life is gay. The spring is not so beautiful there, but lads put out to sea who carry beauties in their hearts and dreams like me. Well, one of my dreams has always been to see Africa, the motherland of the black Americans, and I never hoped really to get that far away. But my very first job on a boat going across the ocean turned out to be on a ship going to Africa. And it was the dream trip of my life, really. We went all up and down the west coast, from Senegal all the way down to Portuguese Angola. We went up the Congo River, went up the Niger River, and I had a view of one whole side of Africa. In the days when most of the colonial powers that controlled Africa would not permit American Negroes to visit Africa. You couldn't get a visa even to go over there. Well, I wrote a number of poems about Africa, but I'll read you only one of the oldest ones, written about 35 or more years ago, and one of the shortest ones. It's a poem called My People. And I think perhaps I know it by heart. The night is beautiful, so the faces of my people. The stars are beautiful, so the eyes of my people. Beautiful also is the sun. Beautiful also are the souls of my people. That's the way the African people seem to me, and that's the way my brothers and sisters in America have always seemed to me. I've been very happy in recent years that the Renaissance of Africa has brought a greater realization of the beauties, the physical beauties of the African people to our people here, and that now many of our people are dressing, styling their hair, proud to look like the African people from whom we come. Just the other day I saw Abby Lincoln, who was a stunning woman even in the days of hair straighteners, but I think is much more stunning now that her hair is Africanesque, you know? Nina Simone, many of our artists are following the African pattern, which I am very, very happy about, happy that we can be proud of being ourselves. Well, in Africa, I saw aspects of the Negro problem that I didn't realize until then were international. We went into ports where the Africans themselves couldn't go in the downtown restaurants, couldn't stay in the hotels. I even saw churches that were segregated right in Africa. I saw one church with a brass rail. The missionaries ran the church, but the white people sat in front, and the Africans to whom they were bringing Christianity were segregated behind the brass rail. Absolutely incredible, but it was true. So I began to realize that this color problem was not just a local one, and the words of Dr. Du Bois, you know, in his beautiful book, Dark Water, really began to sink in at that time when Dr. Du Bois wrote about the time I was born that the problem of the 20th century is a problem of the color line, and he meant the color line stretching around the world. Well, of course, those words are still very, very true because there's nowhere near a solution to that problem of the color line around the world as yet. And so many of my books, many of my stories, a great many of my poems concern just that very problem. And so I will read you now perhaps a half a dozen of the shorter ones of those poems of mine. One of the problems that is very much in the papers of late has been the problem of the ballot and of voting. And I must say that there are steps toward minor solutions in some areas of the South in that regard. And they're largely due to the militancy and the courage and the determination and the lack of fear of the Negro people, like those of the Mississippi Freedom Party. However, this poem, written some years ago, might still very well be true in regard to many areas of the American South. It's a poem called Klux, and it's about a young man who wanted to vote, and in his own words, he tells what happens to him when he went to try to register and vote. Again, a bit of humor in poetry, not very much, but our American problem has so many aspects of humor that it's hard to keep it out of my poems sometimes. They took me out to some lonesome place. They said, "Do you believe in the great white race?" I said, "Mister, to tell you the truth, I'd believe in anything if you just turned me loose." The white man said, "Boy, can it be you are standing there assassing me?" They hit me in the head and knocked me down, and then they kicked me on the ground. A Klansman said, "Listen, look me in the face and tell me you believe in the great white race." Well, of course, we fought a major war to defeat the ideas of Aryan supremacy, to defeat Hitlerism. We did defeat Hitler, but we didn't defeat Hitlerism in many areas of our own country. Another of the problems very much in the papers these days, in which I'm sure you who live out here are very aware of, is the problem of, well, what they call in the papers police brutality. We've experienced it in New York before the Harlem riots. You know, in fact, the term bebop, I asked one of the bebop musicians one time where they got the word bebop for their music. And they said, "Oh man, don't you know that's from the cops hitting niggers on the head? And every time they hit us, the club says bop, bop, bebop, mop, mop." Well, the feeling was that they used to whip Negroes' heads so often that a rhythm was developed, you see, in Harlem. But after the riots, strange things happened, you know. You can't tell me that riots don't do some good. Maybe it's a bad way of doing good, but in any case, the police in Harlem got so polite, you know, that when they went to arrest a Negro, they'd almost tip their hats for a while. And then also it developed that there were always biracial teams going around. You didn't see that before. The squad cars, all white, you know, riding them down the street. Now, ever since the riots, there's a white and a Negro usually, you see. And when a difficult arrest has to be made, the white policeman always turns it over politely to the Negroes. So at least you have the honor of being arrested by your own race most of the time in Harlem now, you see. Well, anyway, when I lived in Watts, and I lived in Watts once for a summer, when was it, about 1934, I was writing a children's book with Arna Bontemps. And I remember distinctly Watts being a very pleasant place in many ways to live, with lawns and nice little houses and nice people. But there was then, at that time, the problem of the police. And everybody felt the police weren't polite to the citizens of Watts because they didn't live there themselves, you see. Funny thing about police, they almost never live where you do. I don't know why that is. Same thing is true in Harlem, you know. You see all these police who don't live in Harlem because, well, you know, they don't. And, of course, you see all these nice shopkeepers who are very nice in the daytime. You never see one of them at night. They don't live in Harlem either. So Harlem is still what you call a ghetto community. And I read in the papers that they call Watts a ghetto community, too. In any case, I was coming home one night late, you know, got off the interurban train that runs out there, and two cops come. I guess they jumped out of squad cars or off of motorcycles or something. And the strange thing about the California police, they have these helmets and things. They look like something out of a German movie, really. They're scary, you know. And I was going home all dressed up because I'd been, I think, to see, Judith Anderson in Medea. A very cultured evening, and here come these cops rushing at me, wanting to know where I had been and where I was going. And I said, "Well, I'm going home." "And where have you been?" "Well, I've been to see Medea." "Well, what's that?" You know? So it's a bit disconcerting, you see. So I wrote this poem because I've had other similar experiences, nothing serious, but experiences like that in Cleveland, of being stopped in my own hometown by the police. Or I must say it never happened in New York. Maybe that's why I still like New York. I don't know. But in various cities, I have been stopped walking on the street. Where are you going? They frisk you and pat you down, you see. Anyway, this fellow had a harder time than I did, and this poem is called Who But the Lord? I looked and I saw that man they call the law. He was coming down the street at me. I had visions in my head of being laid out cold and dead, or else murdered by the third degree. I said, "Oh Lord, if you can, save me from that man. Don't let him make a pulp out of me." But the Lord, he was not quick. The law raised up his stick and beat the living hell out of me. Now, I do not understand why God don't protect a man from police brutality. Being poor and black, I've no weapon to strike back. So who but the Lord can protect me? But we'll wait and see. Well, now, those are all poems of mine that were written some years ago. This one concerns another of our problems. We've got so many problems. You know, you could write a dozen different kind of poems about a dozen different ones. This one's about housing. It's called A Little Song on Housing. Here I come, been saving all my life to get a nice home for me and my wife. White folks flee as soon as you see my problems in me. Neighborhood's clean, but the house is old. Prices are doubled when I get sold. Still I buy. White folks fly soon as you spy my wife and I. Next thing you know, our neighbors all colored are. The candy store's turned into a bar. White folks have left the whole neighborhood to my black self. White folks flee, still there's me. White folks fly, here am I. Well, rather hard to get rid of us, but it's not our fault, you know. We didn't ask to come here. We didn't migrate here like practically all of the other Americans of other ethnic stocks. We were brought here, captives in slave chains. I am the American heartbreak, the rock on which freedom stumped its toe, the great mistake that Jamestown made long ago. Well, the mistake was made, and unfortunately, white America has to put up with us, but also, unfortunately, we have to put up with them, so I guess we're in the same boat. There are words like freedom, sweet and wonderful to say. On my heartstrings, freedom sings all day, every day. There are words like liberty that almost make me cry. If you had known what I knew, you would know why. I think the revitalization, or perhaps we should say the vitalization of American students as a whole in the last decade came about largely through the activities of the Negro kids in the Deep South, the young men and women at Greensboro A&T, at Fisk, at Benedict, at Spelman, who started the sit-ins, who went on the freedom rides, who brought to the attention of all America the gravity of one of our biggest social problems, who interested thousands of other students on other campuses like Oberlin and like University of California and like Antioch, and who helped to create what has developed into a very fine social consciousness on the part of many American students, because 20 years or more ago, American students were in the papers for swallowing goldfish, you know, seeing how many could crowd into a phone booth at once and things like that. And I'm happy to say that the scorn that European students used to feel for our students, that we were infantile is no longer true, because in Europe now, and I was there not many months ago, you read about student activities here which are meaningful, which have some real social meaning, you know. Well, let's see, I would like to perhaps read you 2 or 3 other poems. I started out reading you 2 poems of mine for children. This is a poem about a child. This is perhaps a poem of mine that's most often used or has been in interracial gatherings and people working for racial betterment as a way, I guess, of stressing one aspect of our problem. The poem is about, as I imagine, a little girl of 7 or 8 years old who, belonging to one of those migratory families, a Negro family always looking for a better place to live or better job opportunities. The child is brought up from the South with her family, and perhaps they go to Oakland or Detroit or Buffalo. And in this northern city, this little colored girl who has grown up accustomed to segregation in the deep South and uncertainty doesn't quite know when she goes to a carnival whether she can ride on a merry-go-round or not. And she wants to ride. So this is what she says. Where's the Jim Crow section on this merry-go-round, mister? 'Cause I want to ride. Down south where I come from, white and colored can't sit side by side. Down south on the train, there's a Jim Crow car. On the bus, we're put in the back. But there ain't no back to a merry-go-round. Where's the horse for a kid that's black? One of the aspects, of course, of the one phase of the student movement has been its interest in war, and particularly the current war. This is a poem of mine called Without Benefit of Declaration. Listen here, Joe. Don't you know that tomorrow you got to go out yonder where the steel winds blow? Listen here, kid. It's been said tomorrow you'll be dead out there where the rain is lead. Don't ask me why. Just go ahead and die. Hidden from the sky, out yonder you'll lie. A medal to your family in exchange for a guy. Mama, don't cry. No, sometimes if there's a question period, I'm glad there isn't one, because poetry is poetry and practicality is practicality. And in question periods, people usually ask very pointed and factual kind of questions. And they will ask you, for example, what do you think about the Viet Cong, you know? Well, all I can say about the Viet Cong is that I don't see how anybody in their right minds would want to be captives of the Americans. Because we have been captives for 300 years. And we know what it's like. And they read about us, you see. In papers all over the world, you'd be amazed how almost every day there's a front page picture on the front of the Paris Press or Le Monde of some Negro being drugged down the street by some white policeman. They love to publish those kind of pictures abroad. I'm sure they publish them in Vietnam. And those Vietnamese see those pictures, well, they don't want any parts of that, I shouldn't think. Police dogs, you know, tearing at little children. Fire hoses spraying high school kids. Way down in Africa last spring. On the very front page, you know, pictures of riots over here. And they never show a picture of a Negro beating a white person, you know. It must happen sometime, I guess, but those pictures just never get into the European press. So the American image is not good in Europe, you see, and I'm sure it's even worse in Asia, and therefore I can't imagine the Viet Cong passively accepting captivity. But anyhow, strange things happen in the world, and my poems about the war haven't yet been translated. Almost all my other poems have been translated, even into Vietnamese and Chinese. In concluding, I want to read you, I think, 2 or 3 other poems, not quite so serious. Yes, I'd like to read you one more racial poem, really. It's a poem from my most beautiful book. Look at it. Isn't it pretty? Don't say it's the best book, but it's the best looking book. So if you want a nice book to lay on your library table and not, don't have to read it, get this one, and it's called Ask Your Mama. A lot of critics never quite got the point of Ask Your Mama. And all I could tell them to do was, if you don't understand it, ask your mama, you see? But anyhow, it contains a poem, well, it's all one poem, really. It's all written to be read to jazz in several sections, and I have read it to the music of Buddy Collette, for example, and out here, and to a number of jazz people, Charlie Mingus in the East, and I will read it to you now from a condensed version of one section of it, because it's, to read you the whole poem, it takes about 15 or 20 minutes. The section I'm going to read from is called Cultural Exchange, and I have just had the honor and the pleasure of being sent on a cultural exchange by the State Department. I was sent to Africa to read my poems to the African people, and read them all the way from Dakar to Nigeria to Kenya and Dar es Salaam. Well, Africans have been coming to our country too in increasing numbers, and I think that is one good aspect of something that's happening culturally between our country and our homeland. The Africans, contrary to what some people try to spread, have, as far as I could tell, a very high regard, really, for the Negro people of this country, the black people of this country. And they particularly welcome teachers over there. I saw quite a number of colored teachers in almost every African country I visited, and they're very proud and very happy to have them. And the teachers seem to like the country and and get along well. Ethiopia, for example, there are a number of American technicians and 2 or 3 physicians in the Ethiopian capital. And unfortunately, they don't need people without skills. Many of us would love to go to Africa, but unless we are skilled, there's really no way to make a living, and they don't need you. They welcome you if you've got some money or can live, but don't go there without skills. I just simply tell you that if you have technical training, if you want to open a laundromat even there are some very good laundromats run by American colored people in Nigeria, and things like that are very badly needed. Well, this particular poem, if I can find it, is a poem about what we dream of. It's a condensation from Ask Your Mama, and it should be right along in here somewhere. I am not a poet who ever learns my own poems unless they're very, very short. I don't really like them that well. I know more of Dunbar's poems or other poets than I do of mine. And this would be a rather hard one to learn anyhow. It's a satirical poem, and let's see where it is. Here it is. Yep. Meanwhile, while I have been looking for it, I come across a very, very short one, a new poem of mine, written since my trip to Africa. And one of the things I found over there is that it's absolutely wonderful to be the head of your own government as an African, because 20 years ago. Nigeria and Kenya and all those countries were completely dominated by whites. And now they have their own presidents, their own cabinets, their own customs officials, their own air stewardesses, and in some cases aviators. They're training people to man the planes very rapidly. But underneath it all, when you go to the bank, who do you see in the bank? When you go to get your traveler's checks cashed, who cashes them? When you go to the government buildings, very often the people who are actually in charge of the financial activities are former colonialists. Well, now the explanation is that they have to have these people because they're in a stage of transition. But you look a little further, and who's buying the cocoa beans from Ghana? Who's buying the metals from Ethiopia? The whole economic structure of the world right now, I guess perhaps always will be, increasingly so in modern times, is that everybody really is dependent on everybody else economically. America needs magnesium or whatever comes out of the Congo to make atom bombs. Africa needs Frigidaires. They love Frigidaires over there, and they can't get enough of them, but they can't make them. So you see, has to be this exchange, I suppose, of the economics of modern living. Anyhow, this is a rather satirical little poem, I guess, called Frosting. Freedom is just the frosting on somebody else's cake, and so must be till we learn how to bake. Now, for the poem that I've been trying to read you for the last 10 minutes, this one and one other in closing. This is called Cultural Exchange. In the quarter of the Negroes, where the doors are doors of paper, dust of dingy atoms blows a scratchy sound. Amorphous jack-o'-lanterns caper, but the wind won't wait for midnight for fun to blow doors down. By the river and the railroad with fluid far off going, boundaries bind unbinding, a whirl of whistles blowing. No trains or steamboats going, yet Leontines unpacking. In the quarter of the Negroes, where the doorknob lets in leader more than German ever bore, her yesterday past grandpa, not of her own doing, in a pot of collard greens is gently stewing. Pushcarts fold and unfold in the supermarket sea. And we better find out, Mama, where's the colored laundromat since we moved up to Mount Vernon? In the pot behind the paper doors on the old iron stove, what's cooking? What's smelling, Leontine? Leader, lovely leader, and a leaf of collard green. Lovely leader, Leontine. You know, right at Christmas, my next-door neighbors asked me if my blackness would it rub off. I said, ask your mama. Dreams and nightmares, dreams. Oh, dreaming that the Negroes of the South have taken over, voted all the Dixiecrats right out of power. Comes the colored hour. Martin Luther King is governor of Georgia. Dr. Rufus Clement, his chief advisor. A. Philip Randolph, the high grand worthy. In white-pillared mansions, sitting on their wide verandas, wealthy Negroes have white servants. White sharecroppers work the black plantations, and colored children have white mammies. Mammy Faubus, Mammy Eastland, Mammy Wallace. Dear, dear, darling old white mammies, sometimes even buried with our family. Dear old Mammy Faubus. Culture, they say, is a two-way street. Hand me my mint julep, Mammy. Hurry up. Make haste. And the last poem of mine to be published, which came out in The Nation just last week, I believe, is a new one that I've never read before in public. And so just before I read you the last one that I want to read you, I'll read you this one called Crowns and Garlands. Because, you know, one is always hearing from kindly white friends, look at the progress the Negro has made. And they will point out various areas of progress, which it is true has been made in race relations. And they will always point out, and you have Leontine Price, and you have Ralph Bunche, and Lena Horne, and Sidney Poitier, you know, got an Oscar and so on. Well, we do have, and we're very proud of having them. And this is a poem about them called Crowns and Garlands. Make a garland of Leontines and Ninas and hang it about your neck like a lei. Make a crown of Sammys, Sidneys, Harrys, plus Cassius Muhammad Ali Clay. Put their laurels on your brow today. Then, before you can walk to the neighborhood corner, watch them droop, wilt, fade away. Though worn in glory on my head, they do not last a day, not one, nor take the place of meat or bread or rent that I must pay. Great names for crowns and garlands, yea. I love Ralph Bunche, but I can't eat him for lunch. Well, kind of cynical little poem, I guess. It's very nice to have wonderful people like some of our very fine artists are. And some of them are very, as you know, socially and racially conscious and do some very wonderful things, each in their way. Harry Belafonte and Sidney Poitier are unlike many of the older people in the theater of our race, extremely racially conscious and bring into their monologues oftentimes race consciousness and social significance, you know, and Dick Gregory, of course, you know about. And so we're very proud of all of these people, but nevertheless, the money that they make, the thousands of dollars, and they do make, some of them, an awful lot of money, really, of which I'm very glad. Sometimes I wish I were Sammy Davis myself. The money that they make, some of it is spent as often as they can with the Negro people, but most of it is not, of course, because they don't move in that world where they can spend money for the things they have to have with us and where their managers can, on the whole, be drawn from our race because we don't have people who know all those technicalities of the theater and theatrical law and everything and who get the high fees. And so, well, all I'm trying to say is that simply in this point, that those of us who are still way down on the bottom and who are still riding for an hour and a half from Watts to a job downtown somewhere, the crowns and garlands, well, they really belong to other individuals. The final poem is called Life is Fine. And as we all know, in spite of all of our problems, as Jerome Cushman told you in the poem he read, we're still here. And by the way, the gentleman who so kindly gave me such a nice introduction is lately from New Orleans, where the band comes. It's going to play for you on Saturday night, the Preservation Hall Band. And he's a friend of all the members of that band because he was librarian in New Orleans for a number of years. He knows all the musicians. He's a great lover of jazz, as I am. And I think through him I'm going to have the pleasure of meeting some of the members of that band later on tonight. Well, this poem is a poem that might be said to have been derived from jazz because, you know, one of the basics of jazz is that basic beat which just sort of goes marching on, pounding on, rhythmically dancing on in spite of everything, in spite of all the hardships and difficulties of life. And many of the great jazz musicians have known prejudice in its worst forms because many of them are from the Deep South. And they've written, some of them, very effectively about it. Read portions of Louis Armstrong's autobiographies. Or read Lady Day, Billie Holiday's book, where she tells about some of her tours in the border states and in the South, and where even to go to the ladies' room you had to call on the NAACP, and sometimes you couldn't wait that long, you know? So our artists have known what it is to suffer racial opprobrium. In spite of that, they are able to put forth the most joyous music in the world, because jazz is the happiest, the most conducive to dancing, to movement, to laughter, to life of any music anywhere, and is loved all around the world. And then, of course, it has its sad side through the blues. But under the sadness of the blues, there's always this determination, this marching on, this basic beat that keeps you living. And so this poem, Life is Fine, might be said to have been derived from the blues, really. It's about a young man who thought his girlfriend had put him down. Maybe she had. It's never solved in the poem. And he's thinking about committing suicide. Well, you know, the suicide rate among Negro people is shamefully low. I was talking to a psychiatrist not long ago as to why that was, and she didn't know, this white lady psychiatrist, but she admitted it was true. Also, I read a very interesting piece in the Herald Tribune, I believe last Sunday, largely about LSD. Perhaps some of you have seen it. And in the course of the piece, it said that LSD doesn't work very well on Negroes because Negroes have a natural cool. Well, I don't know if that's true or not, but anyway, well, an interesting observation. You know, there's a joke, which I expect many of you have heard, about a young colored man who wanted to commit suicide in Atlanta. And he went up on top of this high building and was going to jump down. Of course, those of you who lived in the South know very well that there's a great taboo on having physical contact with white women in the South. And you have, of course, all of us have read about the little 9-year-old boy, I believe he was, in Monroe, North Carolina, who looked askance at a little white girl, his next-door neighbor. They were playing games or something. I believe he kissed her on the cheek and was given a year in reform school. That's the cause of what's his name being in China now, you know. All that trouble in Monroe really began at that time. And then you know about Emmett Till, 14-year-old Emmett Till, who was thrown in the river with weights on his feet, allegedly for whistling at a white woman. Well, those things are not funny, but this joke is rather amusing about this young Negro who jumped down from this high building in Atlanta, and just as he was about to hit the ground, a white woman came around the corner, so he curved and went right back up. This poem is about a young man who failed, who didn't commit suicide, but not for that reason. This particular poem is called Life is Fine, and following this poem, Louis Lomax is going to introduce the honoree of the evening, so please sit right where you are, and I will go down so I can see the presentation of the award. This young man belonged to a family like mine, I guess, that this poem is about, a family that traveled a great deal, because in the beginning of the poem you'll notice that streets are mentioned in different cities, and those of you who have lived in Cincinnati will know that 5th and Mound, for example, is in Cincinnati, and Rampart Street in New Orleans, and so on. So the poem goes like this. Could be Hastings Street or Lenox Avenue, Could be 18th and Vine and still be true. Could be 5th and Mound, could be Rampart. When you pawn my watch, you pawn my heart. Could be you love me, could be that you don't. Might be that you'll come back. Like as not, you won't. Hastings Street is weary, also Lenox Avenue. Any place is dreary without my watch and you. So since you don't love me, it's awful, awful hard. Gypsy done showed me my bad luck card. There ain't no good left in this world for me. Gypsy done told me, unlucky as can be. I don't know what poor weary me can do. Gypsy says, I'd kill myself if I was you. So I went down to the river. I sat down on the bank. I tried to think but couldn't, so I jumped in and sank. I came up once and hollered. I came up twice and cried. If that water hadn't been so cold, I might have sunk and died. But it was cold in that water. It was cold. The next day I took the elevator, 16 floors above the ground. I thought about my baby, and I thought I would jump down. I stood there and I hollered. I stood there and I cried. If it hadn't been so high up there, you know, I might have jumped and died. But it was high up there. It was high. So, since I'm still here living, I guess I will live on. I could have died for love, but for living I was born. Though you may hear me holler, and you may see me cry, I'll be dog, sweet baby, if you're gonna see me die.
It is with indeed disturbing and mixed emotions that I spent an evening listening to Langston Hughes read. For believe it or not, the first public appearance I ever made in my life. I was a little boy deep in the heart of Georgia, and I rose during Negro History Week to recite The Negro Speaks of Rivers by Langston Hughes. And as one listens to him, one becomes fully aware of what has really happened in American history. For the pathos that is history, the challenge that is the present, they somehow confluence to promise a tomorrow. Indeed, as Langston was reading the poem of the fellow who was on the verge of drowning himself, I thought of what for us then, when I was working for the Hearst newspaper syndicate, believe it or not, in Chicago, was a remarkable moment. A man who happened to be the last person they got out of a burning building in Chicago. The whole place burned down, and he was the last one they got out, and he was obviously high on whatever. And he was stretched out on the grass in the snow, and they shook him, and they said, "Hey, man, wake up." And he woke up, and he said, "Hey, baby, what happened?" They said, "Well, man, the crib's on fire." "Who put it on fire?" He says, "I don't know." They said, "Well, you should know. You're the last one to come home and go to bed." He says, "Well, I still don't know. It was burning when I went to sleep." The humor aside, the Negro looks at America and he can say, man, it was burning when I got here. And to the degree that he has been here, he has helped put out the fire. And if the Negro, in the process of becoming a part of America, will maintain his basic, essential self and not sell his soul, then his role, and I think historically this is precisely what it is, his role as part of the spiritual fireman in Western civilization will be fulfilled. We can teach them that man can solve his problems without killing his neighbor. We can teach them that violence is not the answer. We can teach them that he who is right in his cause shall indeed overcome. And there is no greater evidence of the fact that we can indeed teach them than a man who even then was a university professor, walked up to the University of Oklahoma and knocked on the door and said, Pharaoh, let my people go, let me learn. And they said, no, George Washington McLaurin, you're a black man. There's no room in the inn. And he looked at them and said, well, I'm going to tell it to Earl Warren and a couple of cats in Washington and let you work with that. And he did. And this was 4 years before the Supreme Court decision of 1954. He beat on the door at the University of Oklahoma. The door opened, becoming thus the first real point in historic integration of higher institutions in America. And so tonight, as one who then was a fledgling young reporter who wrote the story, I am deeply honored to present to George Washington McLaurin for his indomitable courage and fortitude in advancing integrated education, the celebrated case McLaurin versus Oklahoma, 1950. This award from the local Los Angeles, California branch of the Good Samaritan Club for his distinguished service to mankind. How much better a university Oklahoma is that it finally integrated with him. And so for this particular part of the Negro History Week program, I say for the sponsoring groups and committees, thank you and good night.